I'm Ethan. I love muzzleloading. Today we're talking with my friend Barry about his history in muzzleloading. We're going to get into muzzleloader and antique arm collecting, some of the different avenues and some of the different subgroups inside collecting, and then getting into a little bit about how popular culture can affect collecting and some of the red flags out there for you folks out there that are looking to start collecting antique arms and muzzleloaders. Some of the red flags for you to identify when maybe something isn't quite right. To kick us off here, Barry, what got you started in muzzleloading?
Well, I think my story on getting started in this is pretty much reflects what a lot of your other people you've had on have said. And it all starts way back on, in my case, sitting in my my opa's living room on our every Sunday visit to visit them in their little house and watching some form of Wonderful World of Disney at the time, where they were showing some of the the Davy Crockett reruns. So Fess Parker and his muzzleloader,
right?
That really starts it. Those tales were tales, right? But so wonderful, especially for a kid. And one of the things I was really blessed with, living in a neighborhood loaded with kids my age, and we would always try to reproduce wherever we saw on those shows. And so I would say the first muzzleloader I ever built, I must have been 6 or 7 years old, and I went down to my dad's workshop, and I grabbed a piece of wood, and unbeknownst to him, grabbed some of his power tools even, and carved out what looked roughly like a rifle. I used a file to round the wood to make it look like it was a barrel. Screwed on another piece of wood to make it look like a hammer. And that was my muzzleloader. And then for accoutrements, I vividly recall I knew I needed to have, I don't even know if I knew it was powder horn at the time, but I knew I needed to have that thing hanging around my shoulder. So I took a lunch bag, a brown bag lunch bag.
Yeah.
All right. Squeezed off one end, tied a rope around one end, tied the rope around the other end, and I had something roughly the shape of a horn.
Oh my gosh.
That was the powder horn. So, yeah.
How old were you at that time, and around what year would that have been?
That must have been 1971 or 72.
Okay.
Yeah. So I was 6 or 7 years old.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah. And I know that we also, around that time, took an East Coast trip where we visited, a lot of East Coast things like Jamestown, Yorktown, etc., Williamsburg, stuff like that. And I do, vividly recall, and I'm sure a lot of people remember, in all the gift shops back to those old battlefields, they had these toy muzzleloaders. And I really wanted one, but I already had one I made myself, so I didn't get one on that trip. But but ultimately, at some point, I remember I got a pistol, a muzzle-loading pistol, cap pistol.
Okay.
And promptly broke it. I think our first neighborhood skirmish was the end of it. Buttstock, and that broke. But luckily, between my dad and I, we got it glued up enough that it was serviceable. Wasn't as good as skirmishing with the locals, but it still did its job. And and from that point, interesting. My father was the great indoorsman.
Okay.
And right, so he didn't care for going out and camping and all that stuff, and didn't care much for guns. But my mother's side of the family, my mother's dad, so my opa in Germany, he was a grandmaster shooter. And discipline was called Zimmerschützen.
Yeah.
So that's Zimmerschützen. That's basically indoor shooting, room shooting. And when he supplied me, he actually would send over an air pistol for Christmas almost every year, a new and better one. Each year he kind of upgraded. So so by the time I was probably 10, all right, I remember surprisingly enough, he sent me the final one. The best one was a Smith & Wesson air pistol that was just amazing, target pistol. And I have that. I actually have them all to this day.
Oh, that's wonderful.
But, so the firearms influence really came from the mother's side of my family.
Yeah.
And the love of history came from my dad. All right. So it's put
kind
together,
of the perfect
it all
storm.
worked out.
Yeah.
Yeah, it all worked out. All right. So, and that also led to the study of history.
Okay.
And which is something I've done, most of my life that I can remember, at least, was always a love of history, especially material culture history.
Okay. So we've talked a little bit about, your very early beginnings. As you transitioned into adulthood, then what did your interest in muzzleloading become, or how did it change?
Okay. Well, the other aspect is my dad and I were big hobbyist model builders, right? My dad was a model railroader. I was a military modeler, and we lived in California at the time, in the LA area, Los Angeles area. And there was right near Knott's Berry Farm. I can't remember the name of it, but there was a little kind of a village set up there, which was all kinds of different hobbies. All right, so they had a model train store. They had a regular model store, and they also had a muzzle loading store.
No way!
I wish I could remember the name of it. And I went in there, and they had just racks and racks of but they're all like Pedersolis and all that kind of thing.
Wow.
But in the corner, they had. This was also in the days right when videotape was just beginning to be a thing. So they had a videotape running of Wallace Gussler's making a flintlock from scratch video.
Okay.
And we've all seen it. It's on YouTube. God, if you haven't seen it, you have to go watch it.
You've got to watch it.
I would say that you could probably ask so many modern contemporary builders, and they all know this video.
To interrupt you just real quickly here, the video that's on YouTube, I don't think Wallace actually gets anything out of. It's somebody who has uploaded it. So if you can and you want to support Wallace, he's got DVDs available. But sorry, I just wanted to make a mention of that.
But yeah, so they had that video running in the corner of that shop, and I sat there and I watched that video start to finish one time, and that really just got the juices flowing. And that was, I was probably must have been late high school.
Okay.
Because I was off to college shortly after that.
And you were old enough to appreciate it then. You could see the work that was going into it.
Yeah. And I also saw the guns on the racks. And seeing at that time I thought could be nothing more beautiful than the Springfield, 1861 Springfield, reproductions I had on the racks there. I just said, oh my goodness, got to get me one of those someday. And then in college, we at the university I went to, we had an archery range and things like that, but there was no firearms. But every time the Cabela's catalog came out, right, I watched. I would go through that, and I would look at and at that time the Cabela's catalogs had all those guns in it, the revolvers and stuff. So it wasn't too long after college that I began collecting guns in earnest.
Okay.
And I actually started with, because I kind of went forward to backwards at times. So my real love of history at the time was World War II studies, and World War II rifles were just outside of my price range. All right, at the which is still the heyday of CNR type rifles, but World War I rifles were very cheap.
Oh,
right? So,
okay.
Yeah, so I actually started by collecting World War I era rifles, and I would we had a wonderful gun show back in the Los Angeles area. This was still when times were good in California. And we had a wonderful gun show, the Great Western Gun Show at the Pomona Fairgrounds. I've never, the biggest gun show I've gone to these days would have been like one building in the, 8 buildings they had there. And so I would either save up, as a young collector, and go like, okay, I'm going to go get a Lee Enfield this one, next time I was going, okay, I need a Mauser.
Okay.
So I started collecting that way. But at that gun show, there was always the guys off in the corner with their muzzleloaders. And I always came by and, said, wow, that's something I got to get into someday. And then just before we left California, I went to a big show that they had at one of the hunting clubs out there. And once again, saw those Civil War, Springfield rifles on display. I said, okay, that's it. I'm getting one. And when we moved to Indiana, and within a week of moving to Indiana, I went out to one of the local reenactor stores here in central Indiana and picked up that Springfield. All right, I'd always that dream rifle was that. In my case, it's I think it's a Euro Arms Springfield. It was. And that really got the actual muzzleloading black powder thing going. And ignorant me didn't even know that here I am in Indiana. Literally, I call Indiana the black powder capital of the world. Right? I didn't know I was in it. And I remember those first few months struggling to like, where can I get black powder? All those questions we all have, right? Not even realize I had actually already been a member of the NMLRA and hadn't made the connection that Friendship is in Friendship, Indiana.
Oh my gosh.
So I always ignored the Beyond Friendship in the back of muzzle blasts until I finally realized, wow, that's right. That's here in Indiana.
Right there.
So, I guess there's no excuse. I should have known what it was, but I didn't.
Life is busy.
But finally, but slowly but surely, I learned the ropes of black powder. And, the internet was already, by that point, the internet was already in full swing. So I had the benefit of learning, from people on the internet. It was still pre-YouTube, but it worked out. And slowly but surely, made my first trip down to Friendship at some point. And from that point, it was almost a complete transition, from more modern stuff to back to the muzzleloading world. Mm-hmm. And then I went from muzzleloading world, then I started moving forward.
Okay. So this is the front to back to front.
Yeah, from front to back to middle.
To middle.
So now I'm really in the middle.
So we hear a lot about people once they take the step into muzzleloading, they really get into it, and like you said there, you kind of leave the modern stuff behind. Why do you think that is? As somebody who has gone through that kind of transition.
Well, that's a really interesting one, because as we'll discuss, the other big aspect of my firearms hobby and collecting is actually ammunition, right? And I have a very complete reloading shop. I can reload just about anything you could want. And as we all know, there's been many periods over the past 20, 30 years where scarcity has come into play, right? And whenever scarcity came into play, my loading of modern ammunition slowed down because I didn't want to go through all of my beloved primers, right? Centerfire primers. So, and as having muzzleloading already going, it was more comfortable shooting muzzleloaders, and slowly but surely. Well, I don't know if it was slow. Maybe it was very quickly. Just how that the black powder really kicked in and it kind of left the modern stuff behind.
Okay.
I still collect. One of the other, we talk about collecting here, but one of the areas I do collect is early to mid 20th century sporting arms, right? And so these days, that's about as modern as it gets for me shooting. Is pulling out a Savage 99 or something like that.
Right. Let's just jump into the collecting. You've talked a little bit about purchasing some of those first pieces that you started collecting. What drew you to that as something that you wanted to do? Because when I think about muzzleloading, I kind of consider myself a collector, like third or fourth down the list from all of it. So what about it brought it up to front for you?
And I think the answer to that's going to be just plain old history itself, and my obsession with mechanical things, machines, how they work. And, I now consider my early days of firearms collecting to be firearms accumulating. right? So there was no rhyme or reason to the collection. It was the next shiny thing I saw at the gun show or the gun shop, right, was acquired.
Okay.
And mentally, I tried to fit it into a collection, right? But my collection wasn't telling a story of any kind, all right? The muzzleloaders even really weren't telling the story, because I had, the time I started, I had that Springfield 1861. Shortly thereafter, I got a Pedersoli squirrel rifle, a Pedersoli this, Pedersoli that. Then I bought my first gun that had been made, contemporary gun, right? But again, nothing actually fit. Nothing told a story, right? And I think I was looking for that.
Okay.
And so what then fell into was, what is it that I want to collect? So it was this combination of history and then my love of machines and technology. So I decided that I was going to look at and find examples of technology transitions that occurred in firearms. So from flintlock to percussion to breech loader, and how that occurred, all right, and how the nations of the world came into it. So that led me to studying heavily, right, what those transitions were,
right,
and how they fit in one versus the other, right? So, there's the obvious ones, right? Flintlock to percussion.
Yeah.
So, but having an example of a flintlock, okay, I have examples of flintlocks. Having examples of percussion, well, that 1861 Springfield, an example of percussion. But also, none of these were original to the era, right? So then I started looking at my collection, saying, you know what I really need is I need to start collecting original guns, and original guns that fit into a story, and the original guns that show these transitions, right? And so that started down what the focus of my path is that. Okay. Congruent with that is I also am a shooter, and I wanted all of my guns to be shootable, right? So, which does preclude adding to my collection, high decorative fine art guns that I would be scared to death to shoot. So I tend to focus on things that are examples. And some of these are extremely rare guns that I've got put in my collection. Okay. However, they're all shootable, right? So, but the period that occurred between, I always say between 1850 and 1899, just push it to the end of the century. Okay. The huge transitions that occurred, and how each nation kind of had a slightly different approach to it. So you could argue that some were ahead, some were behind, etc. But you're trying to find the firearms that fit into the major transitions. So is my collecting goal. And most of my firearms I purchased over the past decade have fallen into that category.
So it was just this yearning for the collection itself to tell a story that kind of drew you to this path then.
Exactly. And I have the story also applies like to my 20th century guns. Okay. All right. My 20th century sporting guns, it's the same thing. If it doesn't fit as part of a story, all right, it doesn't come into the collection. All right. So, to digress perhaps into that, examples of how John Moses Browning's patents fit in with like the patent for the charging handle, right? And how it forced, that FN guns had it, because they had Browning's patent. Remington had it. Winchester didn't. So you see this period. Where the first semi-automatics are coming out at the beginning of the 20th century, and how poor Winchester didn't have the patent for the charging handle. So there's a story there. So you can show, and when somebody comes over to my house to see the collection, boy, I can bore them silly with these stories. Right? So
that's wonderful.
So you'll see that story is often told between how the Browning Auto 5 influenced the Winchesters and how all that. And the same thing will be true with all of the muzzle loading to cartridge conversion, and that muzzleloading to cartridge conversion period is something that is just extremely fascinating. And then there's the oddball stuff that occurred way sooner than you would ever expect.
Yeah.
The breech loading. One of the prizes of my collection is my Hall's rifle.
Yes.
1819 Hall's rifle. My particular one was made in 1832 and converted to percussion just prior to the Civil War. But how that gun feels like it's such a amazing technology way before its era. So it's a breech loader way before its era. Right. And I also have the Kammerlader, and the Kammerlader is a Norwegian gun that is actually based on the Hall's rifle that was an improvement over it. But then you ask yourself, why did no nation that actually conducted warfare really use either of these rifles? Right? And it does, and by actually shooting them, you get the answer.
Yes.
As technologically interesting as they are and as important as they are, all right, from an actual martial use, they're just lacking over a standard muzzleloader.
I really find that fascinating because as we're talking here, I've just come back from another trip out to Rock Island where I was able to see quite a large window of muzzleloading and that transition that you're talking about. And I think every time I have an opportunity to see a wide array or a collection of arms, I'm beginning to really see those changes and those transitions now. I think more so than even just last year, seeing how the schools changed, how the builders changed, how designs changed. We were talking a little bit before the show that I was able to see from an original French military musket to the American interpretation of that, and then the American arms that were spawned out of that, and how all of that changed. And it's just so fascinating to me because, I think in a contemporary sense, your normal or regular person, however you want to say that, might be into like cars, or like there's a guy in town that's into Corvettes, and he has these different eras of Corvettes and loves talking about how that design philosophy changed at the company. But firearms are the same thing. Muzzleloaders are the same thing. It's just 200 years ago. And it's really fascinating to see those and to run your hand across this stuff and try to understand why the changes happened. And that's what I love about whenever you and I go to the range, or you come back from the range and just tell me kind of a range report of how things went, because you're going into the range with these original pieces as close as you can to understanding what worked and what didn't. When you come home, you have a closer understanding than many of us ever will of, oh, wow, this is why this was never used.
That's right.
It looks cool. It's kind of out of time, but did not work.
Right. So the big example I have of that is the Kammerlader. And if you look up a Kammerlader, I actually have a few videos of my own out there on it. There's a few out there. And it's a technologically fascinating gun, right? It is a rifle, made late 1849s is when they started, so that's pretty early, right? That's ahead of the Minier rifles, and the technology in that firearm is simply amazing. It looks amazing. All right, it actually has a range finding system in the sights. Right, there's a little button on the stock where you're supposed to be able to glance down with your right eye, and if it's lined up, then the physics between your eyeball, the rear sight, which is slotted for the height of a soldier at different ranges. So if you fit the soldier standing up into the sight, you've got the correct range. Technology like that in an 1849 rifle, and of course it is a breech loader. But it's interesting because I used to show that rifle off quite a bit, but I was always the one kind of loading it and handing it to the person to shoot.
Right.
And then I was at a shoot with, I would say, I would call, I'm not going to name drop, but probably the world's foremost firearms expert was there, and he had never played with a Kammerlader before, and I had loaded up ammunition per the original spec and watched watching him trying to load that thing safely, I thought, oh my goodness, if this thing goes off, I have killed the world's foremost firearms expert with my hammer loader. So at that point, after he did that, and we got it loaded, he fired, and he was ecstatic that he fired it. But after watching him do it, I said, that's it. I'm not letting anyone ever fire this gun again, because it is just literally so dangerous to load.
Mm-hmm.
I remember I was at when we were showing it, I think you, Mike Yazel, your dad, and I were looking at it. We were at the Friendship Range, and I asked him, I said, so what's the safe way to do this on this firing line? Because, the whole pointy end down range. Well, this, when you're loading, it has two pointy ends.
Yeah.
One down range, one right up. So these are the things you learn. And then by using it, you can understand why no other nation in the world adopted it, because it was just unwieldy and very dangerous to use. And then, so you go through the list of firearms, and you can see that the period when the transition, when they literally convert a muzzleloader to a breech loader,
a sinful breech
loader, and all
loader.
the nations, sinful. Yeah. So where you have in the United States, you have the Springfields getting converted to the Allen conversion trapdoors. In England, you have the P-53 Enfields getting converted to Snyders. And, every nation, the Austrians had one, the French had one. It was only the Germans who didn't, because the Germans had a breech loader even earlier. So they didn't actually go through that transition. But, and then, but those were all transitions. They weren't ideal.
Right.
Because the militaries and shooters of the world were realizing that big, slow bullets were harder to shoot long range. Now that you could shoot long range, they were harder to shoot long range. So at the same time as that, the transition to, small bore, and of course, small bore in that definition is 45 caliber.
Right.
I don't think any of us, the modern will consider that, but it was a small bore, and it was actually the civilian target shooters that led that transition to the smaller bore, and then the militaries of the world followed. So and there you couldn't. So there's no longer conversions. It was now purpose-built rifles that happened. So in the U.S., we had the trapdoors that most people think of aren't actually conversions. The 45-70 trapdoor, that's not actually a conversion. That's a purpose-built rifle. It happens to look a lot like a Springfield, all right, but it's not. It's actually purpose-built. And in England, you had the Martini Henry, for example,
right,
all right, where those were purpose-built 45 caliber rifles.
Do you think a lot of that?
Again,
oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah, and so basically what you have is that the technology transition isn't just a transition of the firearm, but heavily driven by the transformation and the transition of the ammunition. So tightly coupled with the study and collecting of the firearms. And what a shooter has is now having to figure out how to make the ammunition so they can shoot it in these old firearms as well.
Right, because when we've done the Cabin Fever Challenge together, you're coming in with very appropriate paper cartridges, like for the Brown Bess I think you used last time.
That's right. And figuring out how they actually were made is fascinating. One of the things that we're blessed with and cursed with is all the stuff that the reenacting community has come up with. And also places like the NSSA, they've come up with some amazing ways to shoot. But unfortunately, they're based on kind of a convenience that occurred to make them the way the materials they had and the knowledge they had to make them. In the case of the NSSA, they were plagued for many years by not allowing paper cartridges and now not allowing paper down the barrel. So in terms of like paper patching, et cetera.
Okay.
So they couldn't actually use these things. And so the shooting community kind of followed those worlds, right? They were able to shoot their old firearms, right, very well, but they weren't actually doing it with true historically correct ammunition. And there's a ton of information. A lot of these old armory manuals and stuff still exist, and now they're being shared in PDFs, and a few books have done reprints of them. So now getting access to those and the incredible detail down to how many girls and orphans it took to do an assembly line. The dimensions of the paper, all of that it's out there, and it is something that can be followed, and you end up with what amounts to a more historically correct, not in all cases a better shooting, but a more historically correct cartridge. So that's another very fascinating thing. So yes, when I showed up, for the Cabinet Fever Challenge, the Brown Best cartridges I made were made to one of the armory manuals. In that case, it happened to be a U.S. armory manual. All right, but good enough. All right. I also have reproduced the Napoleonic era Brown Best cartridges, which I find slightly more difficult to use, but they're historically correct. Yeah. And the other thing is like the hunt for the paper. What is an appropriate paper to use for some of these? The Brown Best cartridges don't matter for as much, right? But when you get to like the Enfield, the English cartridge for the Enfield rifle, where the cartridge paper itself becomes a paper patch for the bullet, there dimensionally it's critical. It's got to be very precise or it doesn't work well. So again, there's a community out there led by, he's already been mentioned on your podcast before, a gentleman named Brett Gibbons.
Yes.
Who literally wrote the book on the subject. and I think got a lot of us in the historical shooting world and collecting world to refocus our attention on those kind of details. And it's just been, it's been a wonderful ride.
Yeah. So does the shooting or the experience on the range with an antique arm, does it change a lot when you go through that process of making out the historically accurate ammunition to go along with it? Because I can load from a bag, I can, kind of fumble my way through stuff, but getting into the very limited basic paper cartridges is very interesting to me.
Yeah. I think you have to have also a completely different mindset. All right. A lot of the muzzle loaders really focus on, out to, for the offhand shooters, the woods walk shooters, et cetera, really out to 50 yards. What's the best load I can do to shoot, at that, 25, 50, maybe 100 yards. Right?
Yes.
I know there's bench shooters who go way beyond that.
Yeah.
But let's say somebody shows up with their P53 Enfield. All right. And, if you go down to Friendship, you'll see them being used on the firing line, but you won't see anybody even making an attempt at using historically correct cartridge because they don't work great at those ranges. Right?
Okay.
If you want to win, you're not going to use those. All right. But if you look at it from historical context, that same P53 Enfield rifle had to shoot well at 50 yards out to 600, even 900 yards. All right. So it had, and with one cartridge. All right.
Right.
So you couldn't optimize a cartridge for this particular gun, and you couldn't optimize it for this particular range. It had to work well in all of the P53 Enfields fielded by, the British Empire or the Union or the Confederates. It had to work equally well in all of them at all ranges, right? And that's a different mindset. So we're, in the historical shooting community, we are very happy with ringing the steel at 600 yards, all right, as well as we are with holding a 4-inch, 6-inch group at 50 yards, which a lot of target shooters would be appalled with.
Right.
But we know that we're firing the exact same cartridge, and it's made not to make this particular gun work well. All right. I don't work up a load for making my particular rifle work well. I follow the manual. All right. And if I get muzzle velocities out that match, I'm firing a correct bullet. All right. I'm firing it with a correct cartridge. I'm using a modern powder that's going to be as close to the powders of the era. And through that combination, my muzzle velocity is close to what they said the muzzle velocity was back there. From that point on, it's Sir Isaac Newton who's in charge of the equation, right? And we've got a match, right? So when people see me at the range, they often mock me because here I am with an old weapon, right, an old rifle with historically correct ammunition, and I'm surrounded by lab radars, range cameras, and all the stuff to analyze my stuff. But it's again, it's part of the thing, and again, because I collect that era, I want to know how all the rifles, ammunition, and technologies to make the ammunition, technologies to make the guns and stuff work together.
This podcast is brought to you by Thor Bullets. I've talked about Thor Bullets for over a year now, and I'd like to thank them again for their sponsorship. I have since, in this amount of time, went out and tested these bullets on my range. I have not gone hunting with them, but in my penetration testing and my accuracy testing with my CVA Accura LRV2, I have to say that the Thor Hammer bullets sized to my bore for that Accura do a phenomenal job. I have sub 1-inch groups at 100 yards if I do what I'm doing right with the rifle. Really can't speak highly enough of these bullets. I think you should try them, not just because they're supporting the show, but because they are performing really well in the tests that I am doing. Check out Thor Bullets. This podcast is brought to you by Muzzleloader Magazine, the publication for traditional black powder shooters. Since 1974, Muzzleloader has been the leading magazine devoted to traditional black powder hunting and shooting. Each issue is jam-packed with articles on hunting, shooting, gunsmithing, do-it-yourself projects, living history, American history, book and product reviews, and much, much more. Muzzleloader Magazine is the best traditional muzzleloading magazine, bar none. I'd like to thank Jason at Muzzleloader Magazine for his continued support of I Love Muzzleloading and the I Love Muzzleloading podcast. I don't care what you're into. If you're interested in muzzleloading, this is the kind of magazine I think you need to check out. Thank you, Muzzleloader Magazine, for your support. I love the irony of using 21st century technology to analyze a mass-produced mediocre load for a 200-year-old rifle.
Yeah. I remember when one of the things that we did this year, as a matter of fact, was reproducing for the Civil War era Smith carbine. All right. Mm-hmm. The world, the Smith carbine is an infinitely shootable gun by modern shooters because they use most shooters use a rubber case, which you fill with powder, push your bullet in, and it chambers nicely. And that's roughly based on the earliest versions, which used a rubber cartridge, right? But they had all kinds of problems with it. So I endeavored to reproduce the paper foil cartridge, right? That came just after the paper, the rubber cartridge, and made it to the original specs, original powder, original bullet. Era's gone bullets, and you've heard of them. They make an incredibly accurate reproduction of the Smith carbine bullet, and ran it through the lab radar and just nailed down to a few feet per second of the original load. All right. And once we had all that together, right, you could really see, where that rifle, that carbine shined and where it didn't.
Okay.
So we learn a lot. And making those original cartridges, these paper foil cartridges, it is a seriously difficult task compared to just taking these rubber cartridges you get for 50 cents from any muzzleloading supply store, right? But the joy of having those go off, work great, and accurately reproduce the ballistics of the original round, that brings the whole thing full circle. So right. Collecting the firearms, making the ammunition, shooting it in a historical fashion, and learning from it, going back to the manuals. Wow, it's the same. It works.
It's kind of the information hasn't been lost, but in a way, it's kind of rediscovering it or discovering it for yourself.
Yep, and it really hasn't been lost. I mean, there's so many of these manuals still available.
Yes,
and of course, online now they keep coming up. Somebody finds a manual, scans it in, produces a PDF of it. And it's So an anecdote there is one of the other cartridges that I've been reproducing is for the Snyder rifle. Right, that's when the Enfield P53, it's transitioned to breech loader, centerfire cartridge. The first ones of those were also paper foil with brass and steel base, and so I reproduced that cartridge, right? And I was having a really difficult time with one aspect of it. And another good friend of mine on the internet, another person mentioned Hugh Knight. So Hugh Knight, who wrote a book on the Snyder Enfield, and we were working kind of on how these cartridges were made. And he pulled up a PDF that I had never seen before, and in it there was one key piece of information that said that they were these foil paper cartridges were rolled by girls. The same way that the Enfields, the armories of the world used orphans or girls, young girls, to roll. They preferred young girls because they didn't smoke around powder. But regardless, so they were using these young girls to roll these things, and I couldn't roll this with my adult hands with strength in my fingers.
Okay.
So what I was trying to do was I rolled the brass foil first, and then I rolled the paper around it. And I figured out, if they can roll by hand, how are they doing it? So by rolling the two simultaneous, the paper literally acted as a clamp. So it was just this wonderful eureka moment. And my cartridges went from taking 10 minutes of agonizing, bending and rolling to 40 seconds of easy rolling. Again, and I hadn't found that manual, but I just was talking to him, and he pulled up that manual, and wow, that little piece of information was all I needed, and now we have these original cartridges.
So, forgive me because I haven't studied a lot of military arms history, and I try to be very upfront about that. But why were they going for trying to make such a universal load for military arms? Because we see that through the muzzleloading era into the cartridge and breech loading era. Was it just a lowest common denominator, or shooting for an average, or did the manufacturing capabilities factor into that?
Right. I think the manufacturing capabilities did come into it really heavily. And what you'll see is, the Enfield rifles in England, and the early, like the Mississippi rifle in the United States, and the 1855 rifle prior to the Civil War, they were made for armies that are small, right? And they could take their time making the rifles, and they were made by the arsenals, so made by the Springfield Armory, and Harper's Ferry in the United States. But when the Civil War broke out, the need went from an army that had tens of thousands to armies that were going to have hundreds of thousands, and they had to build these rifles much quicker, right? So you could argue that the English cartridge was actually paired very well with a precision-made Enfield P53, right? And they could get the paper and everything down. But once they started having barrels manufactured all over the place, many commercial arms manufacturers making martial arms, tolerances did loosen up a little bit. And so again, it had to do good enough in all of them.
Okay. And you needed to have somebody that was making a cartridge in New York had to match with a rifle or a musket that was being built in Pennsylvania.
Right. And also the cartridges themselves were made all over the place. So we go to the Civil War, right? The American Civil War. The cartridges were made all over the place, right, as well. And there's a series of books called Round Ball to Rimfire, which is basically the cartridges of the Civil War. And there they have, literally they have correspondence in there between the armories and the manufacturers. How they had to reject them because they were producing bullets that were too small of a caliber, or the paper wasn't right, the powder loads weren't right. So it became a very difficult task. So, but ultimately there was a specification for what they should be. And that specification was based on what was going to work best in all rifles firing at all ranges.
Gotcha. Which is a pretty large task for one load.
But it did mean that, these weren't tack drivers at 50 yards, they weren't, but they were more than good enough. I hate using the term, these guns were inaccurate, because they were not inaccurate.
Right.
But they were accurate enough.
So tell me a little bit about some of the shoots that you attend and that you go to, and you've tried desperately to get me to go to. It just hasn't lined up yet. But where you're getting it together with other collectors and other enthusiasts and shooting historic arms with historic ammunition like this.
Yeah, the one of the internet forums that is really good for this is the British Militaria Forum. We call it the BMF. And for many years now, groups on the BMF have had a similar format shoot. We call it a Victorian Rifleman shoot. And they're done around the world, but in North America, there's the three big ones are the Alberta shoot, which is now an invitation-only shoot up in Alberta, hosted by a gentleman up there and popularized by the YouTube station British Muzzleloaders. And then there's the Springtown shoot in Pennsylvania at the Springtown Rod and Wheel Club near Easton, Bethlehem, Pennsylvania. And also in Kentucky, we have the Bowling Green Victorian Rifleman shoot. And they're all of a similar format. And it's really, while there is some competition that goes on, it's of the friendliest variety. But mostly it's about shoot my rifle. And people tend to want to, find the rarest, coolest original rifles to shoot. And so it's a great place to go to those shoots to actually see these original guns being shot with incredibly knowledgeable enthusiasts. Right, with amazing collections and and being able to shoot them and acquire them. They're a great place to find these old guns too.
That's awesome.
Yeah. So very informal, kind of, if you want target shooting, competitive may not be your thing. If you want to listen to some of the, foremost firearms experts or talk about it, amazing place to go. And of course, if you want to shoot any of these things, if you show up without a gun, you will shoot the whole day without stopping. So people hand you their rifle to shoot.
That's awesome. That's something I love about muzzleloading and historic arms. I think just in general, everybody's excited to see and show you something that they have.
And that's a big part of these shoots. And again, great people. It's again slightly different crowds you might find because there's a more of a historical, hardcore historical aspect to it.
These kind of folks aren't necessarily going to a competitive muzzleloading match or a living history like rendezvous type event.
There's some carryover, but yeah. It's somebody who has done a whole lot more book reading and collecting.
Right.
The other aspect of being a collector is, next to my firearms collection, the largest collection in my house is my book collection.
Right. They go hand in hand.
Right. I know that the two of us have gone through using my collection to find out the prices of Thompson Center Hawken rifles in 1976.
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah. So in my collection is all of that, books that cover all of that.
That's awesome. I mean, that's just been invaluable to me trying to find research points for projects that I hope to launch in 2024 here, because it's been neat diving into that, at least through our group chat and then going through my library as well, because there's so much out there to learn. And
there is, and some of these books themselves are collectible.
Right, exactly. So you mentioned that you're shooting like these historic cartridges in these military arms and things, but for your more civilian arms, like the different flintlocks and civilian percussion rifles that you have, you're still going through and doing load development for those, aren't you?
Right, exactly. And so, my YouTube channel is called The Volunteer Rifleman. And that actually is meaningful in that I'm also very fascinated by the various volunteer state militia, early National Guard things, and where where the source came up for those. So, for instance, in England, we already mentioned earlier about how it was the competition shooters that really pushed the smaller calibers, right? At places like Wimbledon in the United States, Creedmoor, at those competitions, and that was heavily influenced by these volunteers. And let's be honest, the volunteers in England were much less people who had become professional soldiers than they were gun nerds of the era. And so for instance, one of my Snyder rifles is one of the guns made to a much higher quality level than the Snyders were for the military. And those guys would do the same kind of load development, everything else that we do. So while I do have a standard Snyder military load, believe me, I also have a Snyder load that works really well in that rifle. So that does fall back into we're nothing new.
Right. It's just you're recycling stuff all the time.
And I love building and working on rifles. That included building a couple of Kibblers. And those, when I'm at the range, I would still say well over probably 60-70% of my range time is still with muzzle loading flintlocks, right? either my own made or contemporary, and those I spend wonderful hours trying to find that perfect load.
So what loads do your Kibblers like then?
Well, I have a 36 caliber Southern Mountain rifle, and it really likes a 40 grain load of 3F.
Okay.
All right. And let's see, that one I use I didn't even look at my mold, but it's probably 3.5, probably 3.50 or 3.55.
Yeah.
Right.
That sounds right.
Something like that. And then I also have the regular Colonial rifle in 58. And 58 is nice because, at least from a accessories perspective, it matches the vast majority of my military rifles, which are 58 or 5.77 caliber.
Okay.
Right. So at least my cleaning jags and all that stuff work between them. And that one, I have actually found my favorite load there is a 60 grain load of Swiss 2F. Right. And that is again, it's probably a 5.70, maybe it's a 5.75. It's not, maybe a 5.75. Well, again, I don't have that off the top of my head. I have to go down to my shop and pull my mold out.
Right.
I know that I with that one, before actually investing too heavily in molds, I always go through and go to Flintlocks LLC or someone like that and buy a couple bags of different balls. And figure it out and then get the mold I need.
Right. You don't go buy the mold first.
Yeah. So we do. I still do. Again, most of my shooting is still plinking with flintlocks.
Right. It's hard to beat it, man. It's just hard to beat it.
It is.
one thing
and they don't consume primers.
That's right. Sharp rock make boom. That's something I wanted to talk with you about is some red flags to look for in collecting, because I'm not necessarily calling myself a collector yet, but I know that in the future there's going to be some things that I'd like to collect, and I think there's some other folks out there that could stand to benefit from some words of wisdom from somebody like you who's been collecting for such a long time and has such a laser focus with it.
Yeah. Well, before you invest in any firearm that is of any value, right, make sure you know what you're looking at. So, which is where that book collection comes into play. And and then there is looking for the telltale signs that something isn't right. A stamp that looks like somebody engraved it rather than an arsenal stamped it. Mm-hmm. And knowing where those, where the kind of place where people try to pull things off, pulling over on you, and what is actually legitimately a correct, a old gun, but maybe doesn't have the provenance to it. And one of the names you're going to hear a lot especially in the martial firearms collecting world is Bannerman. Right? So Bannerman was a late 19th century, early 20th century, literally Army surplus store in New York, and they had a catalog. So you'll hear Bannerman catalog all the time.
Yeah.
Right. And Bannerman was one who would buy up surplus firearms, right, and sell them. Right, and through his catalog, but he also bought surplus firearms parts, and he basically took these parts and assembled something close to an original, like a Springfield or a trapdoor, things like that, and but they aren't. All right, they're parts guns that were made in the late 19th, early 20th century. All right, so being able to identify a Bannerman is a skill that you'll come up with. So, for example, I was at a show not too long ago where, and then also the obvious things, anybody who says that this pistol belonged to Jeb Stewart, no, it didn't. But or the classic is this was a 7th Cavalry, little bighorn weapon,
right?
And I actually saw a trapdoor carbine not too long ago sitting on a table, and it said 7th Cavalry, and I took it up and it's a carbine, and it's like that. You flip it over, and Bannerman, what they did is they took full length stocks, cut them down, and filled the rimwad channel with a piece of wood, and just sanded it all up. All right.
Okay.
And they sold it as cavalry, trapdoor cavalry carbines. Well, so this one I picked it up, turned it over. Sure enough, there was a piece of wood, that was very nicely, stitched into where the ramrod channel used to be. So that's nothing more than a good old trapdoor. As a shooter, not a bad rifle as a shooter, but it's not a 7th Cavalry gun, and it's not a historic gun. But so being able to identify that. However, just real quick, there is a legitimate collecting world. People who collect Bannermans. Right? So why not, right? It's still something to collect, right?
Exactly. That's great.
Yeah. But I think research, if you don't know what you're looking at, find somebody who does know what they're looking at to come with you to look at it. And then there's reputable sources.
Okay.
You worked with Rock Island quite a bit. And from my experience, especially the Rock Island Premier auctions, they're not going to deceive you. Right. So the descriptions are good. I bought quite a few rifles from Rock Island over the years, and never been disappointed and never been taken. Right. I get what they, so a good place to do is a reputable auction house.
Yeah, because they depend on that, not just Rock Island, everybody does. They depend on that reputation. And there have been times where when I've been there, when things have been questioned and I've paused filming on something because we need to verify something. And I've heard quite a few stories from them and other auction houses as well. Not to like peek behind the curtain or anything, but from what I understand, everybody's very open about this the goal is to just straighten it out, to just figure out what was actually in front of everybody here. So that in the future it's corrected and it's right, because sometimes that stuff changes over time and things get a little muddy, and that's history for you. Everything's a little muddy.
So bottom line, red flags, if it looks too good to be true, that's always a red flag. Okay. You're probably not getting Robert E. Lee's 1851.
I think that's good. It's something that I don't think anybody can argue with, of, doing your research on it, especially before you put money down on the table. And there are some guns where the counterfeiters, it's just not worth it, the effort to try to make a counterfeit of certain guns. Right. So what you'll find more often than not is on the counterfeits is originals that have had like markings adjusted. Okay. Right. So that's a case where knowing what the markings should look like. There is one collecting world that I just will not play in, and that's collecting Luger pistols. Ah, okay. Because there is a huge market of fakes, and most of them are they're not fake guns, right? But they've taken what isn't a collectible Luger, and they've tried to make marking modifications to them, right, to put them into from the that's a $1,000 Luger to try to turn it into a $7,000 Luger. Okay. Right. Like flipping a house. Yep. And so that's an area where I don't know enough to play in it. And from my understanding, there's a lot of that goes on. There's a lot less of that goes on in the muzzleloading world. Yes. Yeah. It's just not worth it. Yes. It's interesting to me that there have been things brought to my attention over the years here that I do question, but then it's one of those things. It's like, what? There's not a lot gained here, right? If something's kind of parts put together, and it's just kind of like, man, I guess this is like $500 worth of parts, and together it's, I don't know, maybe $1,200, maybe. And that's something I appreciate about muzzleloading, is that, there are definitely, those 5-figure guns and at times those 6-figure guns out there. But for most of us, that's not a world that we're playing. We're not playing cards at that table. Right. And when you're in that world, you are dealing with people who are going to spending that kind of money. They're going to also spend the money on the expert to be with them. Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. So if anybody is out going to go buy an original Colt Walker, all right, since you're looking at a $500,000 price, if you can afford that, you can afford the expert to be right beside you when you're looking at it. Right, absolutely. It's just insurance at that point. Yeah. One of the last things I wanted to run by you here, Barry, and I haven't seen it, but I wanted to get your review of the new Napoleon movie. Okay. And if you can, start out with spoiler free, and then right. I mean, it's presumably historical, so there's spoilers, but but mention if you're going to say a spoiler, let people know. Right. Yeah. Okay. So first of all, let me start by saying I love movies, and I am not one of those people who tears a movie apart because of historical inaccuracies. If you can tell a good story and you modified some of the history, I'm okay with that. Like The Patriot. Yeah, I'm actually like The Patriot. I do too. It's a fun movie. But of course, if I'm a pedantic historian, I'm going to hate the movie. Right. But I like it because it's a well-made, well-paced movie.
All right. Some of my favorite movies, the Zulu Dawn.
Right.
The list goes on of movies that are, roughly historical, but are really well-made movies. All right. So that's just the way I am. So I'm not one of the pedantic historians. What I want when I go to the movie theater is I want to be entertained. So, and there aren't real spoilers with Napoleon, right? Because most of us know what happened with Napoleon.
Right.
So, but of course, maybe it is a spoiler because the movie, again, it has zero historical. I mean, it's historical in that it's set in France, and there's this guy called Napoleon. Right.
I was afraid of this.
Yeah. So, and again, the story. So, if I want to just make a fiction story, I want to make fiction about a young man, who rises from nothing to be emperor of the largest conquering nation that Europe has seen in 1,000 years. All right. If I'm going to write a fiction story about that, I'm going to make that character, that central character, somebody who we believe could have done all these things. All right. So fundamentally in the movie, we don't get that. All right. We get some guy who fumbles through history, is moved on by his influential brother at best. All right. In my opinion, a terribly made film.
That's heartbreaking.
The filmmaking isn't good. The pacing is dreadful. The battle sequences are. I think that they took Lord of the Rings as their model for how to do a battle. There's lots of melee and guys running around, knocking each other over. Like in the battles, the only thing they got right was. Only in essence is how at the Battle of Austerlitz the French opportunistically realized that the Austrians and Russians were retreating across a frozen lake, and they used artillery to crack the ice on the lake. That historically did happen, but of course the way they showed in the film is entirely wrong. The battle being Austerlitz being a masterpiece of generalship. None of that came through in the movie. And then for the firearms guys, right?
If I want to go see old guns, how is it?
Yeah, and in the Napoleonic period, there is one rifle that has achieved legendary status above all because of the TV show Sharp's Rifles. And that's the Baker rifle.
Right.
And then, so at the Battle of Waterloo in the film, which the only thing it shares with the actual battle is the name of Waterloo. But they show some 95th Rifles guys with a Baker rifle that has a telescopic sight, strapped on top with leather straps. The telescopic sight was still 30 years away from being invented, and of course we all know how you can't just strap with leather straps. And then Napoleon leading the cavalry charge. When in actuality he was rather sick, sitting in a tent in the back, but he was leading a cavalry charge, and one of these 95th rifles, the Baker rifle with a telescopic sight on it, shoots at him and puts a 20 millimeter hole through his hat. At that point, I thought, well, this is just a comedy.
Right.
So again, spoiler alert, I guess, but it didn't. We know that he loses the Battle of Waterloo.
Right.
But so you have that moment of, oh, look, there's the 95th Rifles there, and there's a guy with a Baker rifle. Wait, what's that?
Right. It's like
he's got a scope on it.
They know what you want to see.
Yeah.
And then it's like they've given you a pie, and then they put cake icing on top for some reason.
Something, yeah. So unfortunately, the key thing about Napoleon, I wish that they had either not done any battles and just shown how he rose, or show how
kind of the social aspect of it.
Right. So it just suddenly at some point there's the coup where he becomes first consul, but then suddenly he's coronated. So missing the entire Italian campaign where, he crushes the Austrians for the second time and comes home to be, there's no question this guy's going to be emperor. So first consul now becomes emperor, and then none of that happened. It just suddenly he's emperor. And you have no idea why this guy who's, basically a blithering idiot can become a emperor. So
maybe they took too much inspiration from modern politicians.
It could be. I don't know. Unfortunately, it's hard to do his entire adult life.
Yes, it's a saga. I mean, it's just incredible.
It screamed out. This should have been a miniseries,
right?
On streaming services rather than a movie, or just focus on one thing.
Yeah,
one of those movies that is really well done. I think it's 1972's Waterloo. A movie of equal length to this one, but just about Waterloo. So
I'll have to check that out. I have not seen that one.
Yeah. That's a magnificent film showing what Napoleonic warfare really was like, and rather than showing it to be a Lord of the Rings fantasy battle.
Well, I appreciate you sharing.
I cannot give the film a thumbs up. I was, I literally bought my tickets to see it 2 weeks before the movie came out. I was really excited.
The trailer looked so good.
The trailer deserves the Academy Award. Movie not. I
was so hopeful that this would be like, a great media buildup going into the sesquicentennial here. Like, okay, we've got a great Napoleon movie. People are jazzed. We can talk about the Napoleonic era. It's tangential to the birth of the United States. We can, ladder on this interest, get some more people going, get some excitement brewing. But just about everybody that I have talked to or seen the review that is into this stuff has felt the same, and it's a pretty big bummer. My wife and I had kind of decided with our toddler, it's going to be the kind of thing we wait for it to come out on DVD, and I think it's going to be like a rental for a night of the DVD. It's not even going to be on the shelf.
and nice that you can pause it and go do something else and come back to it.
Right. I can change a diaper real quick.
Right. I was actually ready to walk out of the theater about 3/4 of the way through. I was like, I just can't take any more of this.
What happened? Was it the Baker rifle?
No, the Baker rifle actually was. I would have missed the Baker rifle at that point.
Oh.
No, it was just how this blithering idiot could become, emperor.
Mm.
It's just there was just nowhere did I see, the genius or Napoleon, the treachery of Napoleon, whatever it is.
Right.
But there's nothing that said, how did this man come to power?
Weird.
Yeah. And be so loved by his marshals, which by the way, the marshals were not in it at all. The Napoleon's marshals were incredibly important part of him coming to power, holding power, and being successful in the battlefield. Why did his soldiers rally behind him? How could somebody, coming back from exile, landing in the south of France, building an army as he moves forth to Paris to retake, literally a man coming off of a ship with his personal bodyguard coming back after his exile, and within 100 days raising an army enough to go fight the Battle of Waterloo.
Right, exactly. It's incredible.
Yeah.
Oh, well, maybe next time, guys. Maybe next time.
That's right. We always hope for that next great epic.
We're hoping for the next one.
movie.
Oh, man.
Oh, yeah. And to cycle back around to collecting, boy, movies have a huge impact on collecting.
That's right. We didn't even talk about that. So talk about that. I mean,
right.
With the... I don't know. I guess for me, I'm much more focused on earlier than the military arms and things. But how have the movies that have come out and what movies have affected that community?
Well, I think number one for us has to be Jeremiah Johnson. Right. Or even going back. I mean, Davy Crockett.
Yeah. I mean, that's what brought you into it.
Right. And then Jeremiah Johnson. How many Hawken rifles did that movie sell?
Oh my gosh!
It started a whole industry, right?
Yeah, it did. It literally started an industry.
Yeah, and then again, looking at the black powder world, the next big transition. If you've looked at pictures of friendship right? From during the Jeremiah Johnson period, it's all teepees, in the primitive area, right? And then suddenly there's this transition from teepees to wall tents, right? And that jives with Last of the Mohicans,
right?
Another movie, a great film. Okay, I mean, Last of the Mohicans is based on a novel, right?
Yes,
it's not even based on real thing, right? But how many people wanted flintlocks?
Oh my gosh! After
Last of the Mohicans.
Absolutely.
So I think we really could use another movie like that. The movie Tombstone, what that did for the cowboy action,
right?
All right. Of course, not to mention the number one best-selling gun movie of all time, Dirty Harry, right, with the Smith & Wesson Model 29 pistol.
Everybody needs a Dirty Harry gun.
Yep. So, I think that's big, and I don't think we've had one in a while, and I think that if we had a movie that could do that,
I mean, the most recent one that comes to mind for me is The Revenant. But that, as popular as that was, and I enjoyed it as a movie, not as a historical documentary, it didn't really ignite that spark a whole lot. I didn't see it, I guess, a whole lot. I mean, I think COVID did more than The Revenant did, which is really kind of a bummer for as good of a movie as it was.
Yeah. Well, I think one of the things is the gun a character in the film? Right? Okay. So in Jeremiah Johnson, his 50 caliber Hawken that he pulled out of the hands of I can't remember the name of the
Hatchet
character,
Jack.
I mean, that gun becomes a character at that point. It has a story.
Right.
Itself has a story.
That's
right?
true. Yeah.
I mean, Last of the Mohicans, the long carbine, Hawkeye's rifle. There's a story
silk
there.
Patch.
Yep. The silk patch. Yeah. I think the firearm has to be a character.
Okay.
And in many of these movies, they are. I mean, even in The Patriot, you could argue that when he pulls out his guns and hatchets from his trunk, that immediately establishes history of the personal history with this guy.
Yeah, that stuff's getting real now. Mel Gibson has opened up the trunk. It hasn't been opened.
That's right.
Don't make us open up the trunk, folks.
Yes, and then that's filmmaking.
Right.
And it's the history we're talking about here.
Right.
It's and if the filmmaking sells firearms and gets people into the hobby, I'm good with it.
Right. Yeah, that's how I look at it. Yeah. Well, Barry, this has been great. Where can people find you online if they want to hear more of your musings or ask you questions about any of the topics we've discussed here?
Well, I do have a YouTube channel, The Volunteer Rifleman. It's still, I would say it's in its infancy, but it's not. I've had the channel since the beginning of YouTube, but only in the past year or so put any effort into it. So you'll find a lot of just shooting videos and how-tos. I've got some how-to videos on making cartridges up there. I'm going to be putting a few more up there, trying to stay within the terms of agreement with YouTube on what we can and can't show for making ammunition.
Right. Yeah. It's ridiculous.
The other place where you can usually find me is a number of the Facebook groups where I'm active in. There's this Facebook group called I Love Muzzleloading, which I spend quite a bit of time there. Historical Shooting group. It's an excellent group for people who are interested in shooting their firearms in a historical fashion. And those are probably the two best places to interact. I do have Instagram, again, the Volunteer Rifleman, but I keep forgetting to post stuff there.
It's hard to do it all.
Yeah.
Especially when you're not a full-time firearms historian and collector.
Yeah.
Well, Barry, thank you very much.
Well, thank you for having me.
I'd like to thank Barry again for taking time out of his evening here to talk with me a little bit about this. I've talked with Barry a ton. You've seen him in some of the videos and things, but I still came away from this conversation learning a little bit more than I knew going in, which is really exciting and something I really love about the podcast here. It's an opportunity for me to learn, and I really hope that you've had a similar experience. Hope that you've enjoyed the episode, and I hope that you've learned a little bit and can maybe pass some of this stuff on to some of the folks in your life maybe that are out there looking to get into the collecting side of this. Like I said, it's not something that I have a whole lot of experience in at all. I have an appreciation for this stuff. I can point out some of the different eras and schools and designs and makers. That's really as far as it goes for me. I've got a young kid, not doing a whole lot of collecting right now, but I hope to be in a position like Barry is here in the future, where I can be collecting some of these pieces and appreciating them and studying them further. I want to circle back here real quick as we close to what Barry said about books. And it's something I try to bring up whenever somebody asks me how to get started in muzzleloading. If you want to really get started right, I think, in muzzleloading or in collecting like Barry is here talking about, like Barry's talking about here, books are a really hard way to go wrong. They are very affordable for the most part, and they are accessible. You can order them, have them shipped to your house, and they're full of a wealth of information. So even if you're looking to buy, your first muzzleloader, or you're looking to collect your first muzzleloader or your 50th muzzleloader, it's hard to go wrong with purchasing a book. Books, they range from 10 to like $100 at the upper end for a lot of the books that I've seen. Like I said, some of the books get into the collector territory. They're $300-$400, but the number of books that are out there really that are affordably priced and are accessible, it is just incredible. I think as niche and as small as we think of muzzleloading being and antique arms being, history in general, as small as we think of all these things being, there's a wealth of affordable knowledge out there for you to start out with, for you to get involved, kind of scratch that itch that you might have for something out there, learn a little bit, and you're going to go into the next situation. You're going to be able to take that next step with some sure footing. So just really want to reiterate that even if you're not in a position to go out and start collecting or acquiring muzzleloaders in mass here, you might be in a position, to check out a few books that are out there to learn a little bit and get your head on straight before you make that next step. We talked about it a little bit in the episode, but I did just get back from another trip out to the Rock Island Auction Company. As we're recording, we have a few videos out, and we're going to have a whole lot more coming out over the next couple weeks. So I hope that you, if you're interested in that kind of stuff, if you're interested in antique arms and some detailed overviews of them, be sure to check those out. We'll have them at ilovemuzzleloading.com. as well as at the I Love Muzzleloading YouTube channel. That's all I've got for you this week. December here is a really busy month. We're going to get back into the shop. We're going to get on the range. We're going to hopefully get some deer hunting done here. With Christmas coming up, things get a little crazy, but there's a lot going on in muzzleloading, I think, as we head towards the new year. Now is the time, really, guys, to get out there and get your projects lined up for when hunting season closes. Get your projects done before spring and the nice weather comes back here. Because if you're like me, you're going to want to be out in the woods and not cooped up in the shop or in the house researching and reading. So that's just kind of my yearly reminder for you out there. Get your projects lined up. Let's get them finished in a timely manner so we can get back out there and have fun. Once again, I'm Ethan. I love muzzleloading. Thank you so much for listening. We'll catch you next time.